I realize I didn't formally introduce myself at the beginning of the session. I'm Peter Mangione. I'm moderating this panel as well as, and I'm from WestEd, moderating this panel as well as giving a presentation. The panel itself, we didn't create the title of this session, and I think all of us were thinking about how does research relate to Anji play in some sense, and that's why you're going to get such a full range of ideas about research. We've already had two very different perspectives, one looking at the work of Lev Vygotsky in that framework and how it relates to Anji play, and the other from Mariana Russoni, who helps us see at the macro level what this idea of risk is like. What I'm going to do is step back and consider with you for a few minutes here what would be some interesting questions. And this is just a sample of questions because there are countless questions, infinite possibilities for questions we could ask and study from a research perspective when we're talking about Anji play. But when we're talking about research in Anji, I think we need to be clear about the purpose. And the most important purpose, already there's a wonderful amount of research going on in Anji. We all saw this the last few days. We all know this. It's teacher research. And their purpose in doing this research is to be responsive to the needs of the children and to continuously improve practice, continuously improve how they're supporting children's learning. That is the most important research we could ever want or imagine for the kindergartens in Anji. So when we talk about research, that should first come to mind, that this idea of teachers doing their own research. There's also this thought about we need research that studies the effects of Anji play, that from the outside, so that the greater world of researchers and peer-reviewed journals can say this is a valid approach to supporting children's early learning, and it has benefits and we can define outcomes. So there is this interest from a research technical point of view with this purpose of looking at Anji play from the outside and determining its value, its benefits for the children who are in the kindergartens. So for example, and it was talked about a lot yesterday, we could focus on 21st century skills. That might be a benefit of children who are participating in Anji play. And we could study that, right? There are a number of ways to study that topic if we start defining those 21st century skills like critical thinking and creativity, etc. They were creative problem solving, they were mentioned yesterday. But before we go there, what I'd like to do is identify a couple pieces of research that I think is very relevant for understanding what Anji play offers to children. One piece of research is by Alison Gopnik at the University of California at Berkeley. She talks about various studies from experimental psychology looking at child development, experimental developmental psychology. And a couple kinds of studies she describes in her writings are, for example, if you show a 3, 4, or 5-year-old something presented on a screen and look at where that child's eyes go, the child covers all areas of the screen. If you look at an older child or an adult and you do the same study, where do their eyes go? Their eyes go to the middle of the screen because culturally we have learned that that's where the key information is. But for children at the preschool age, young children, they are open to the world. Their minds work differently. And they can work with infinite possibilities in ways that we no longer can do very well. We have to learn from them, regain that learning of how to look at infinite possibilities and use that in a playful way in our own process of thinking and feeling. Another study which she describes, Alison Gopnik describes, is interesting, where an experiment was set up where you give a child a toy that can do 4 interesting things, and at one time you tell the child the one thing to do. And what does the child do? The child does that one thing. You tell the child, this is what it can do. You show, so the child has it demonstrated. Then the adult leaves the room and says, play with it. So the child does what the adult showed. What the child perceived was what I'm supposed to do with this toy or game. And so you can see the child doing the thing over and over again and becoming bored. As Cass Holman said, easy becomes boring. And once you've got mastery, it becomes easy. If you just tell the child with this same toy, I'm going to leave the room and you can play with it, within 2 minutes or 3 minutes, the child discovers all 4 ways to play with the toy. Again, it's that young child's mind that's working in this very open way, considering all the different possibilities through play. And that's how children have to learn. That's how young children have to learn. So we can talk about principles applying throughout life around play, and there are principles that apply throughout life. But we also have to keep in mind the developmental perspective, which is preschool age is a very special time when the mind is developing and needs a kind of learning experience to be playful and consider all possibilities. That is the optimal way for young children to learn. A second point that was brought up at various times through various comments we heard in the last couple of days was about a developmental perspective. We'd like to know how these children are doing in the long term. That's where this whole idea of the 21st century skills comes up, right? Because what we're doing in Anji play is going to help children have the 21st century skills when they're older and need to adapt to a world they don't know about, a world we don't know about, that's completely unpredictable to us because the world is changing so fast. And finally, what I'm going to suggest this morning, there's so much research that could be done, and I think Dr. Veraska started to point that out for us about how the adult engages in the adult's role in Anji play. I'm going to just suggest some research questions about the learning and development of children. But certainly there are countless possibilities that we could start to study from the outside and understand that teacher's role. It's interesting, our colleagues in Reggio Emilia use this idea of provocation, and as I was hearing the different presentations over the last few days, a provocation that came up for me is I believe everyone here believes in returning the right of play to children. That's priority number one, the play revolution. And at the same time, we talk about defining goals and promoting children's development and learning. And I wonder if those two ideas, those two purposes, are sometimes at odds. Or do they work hand in hand? Are they in harmony? And I think each of us needs, as we consider Anji play, to face that question, to face that provocation. If fundamentally we believe that the most important thing that's happening with Anji play is to return the right of play to children, we should take no action that impedes or interferes or disrupts with that main purpose. However, we do have this idea that we want to demonstrate to the world that it has benefits, that we want people who have financial resources to invest in approaches like Anji play. We want families to embrace Anji play. And one of the ways that helps people do that is when they have research which says, yes, here are clearly identified benefits from research. I can see how this helps children. Much like, we could think about the research from Mariana Bressoni that helps us with that. And then finally, I think that when we think about research and what children are learning, this idea that keeps coming up in discussions, and I think is a very important idea when we consider how young children learn, those infinite possibilities, those infinite combinations of what they can do. At one point, this idea of the child's experience as whole or integrated, and one of our speakers talked about the weaving metaphor, that all of the different kinds of learning, the 5 guideline areas and the guidelines you have here in China, are woven together. And I think when we talk about research and studying it, we want to support the children's whole learning experiences. So we need to approach the work in a way that is respectful of the child's whole experience, of everything being woven together, all the learning being woven together, and understand the learning and development that we're observing from that perspective. So it's observing. We can learn from the teachers how they do that, right? Observing, listening, documenting, as keeping it whole as the children are learning, and that's a kind of assessment. If we were to go the other route, let's take the weaving metaphor again. If we look at it, we can look at a thread and see how beautiful it is and how it fits into the whole pattern and creates a work of art for us. Or we can really want to study that thread and pull it out. But what happens when we pull that out? The weaving unravels. And so it comes apart, and we lose the whole. And I think that's one of the risks that we're running when we start to identify particular areas to study. And what we want to do as we do that, as we think about that, because I believe there will be more and more of this outside perspective on doing research on Anji play as it becomes more and more widely known throughout the world. We want to encourage people to keep that whole fabric together. Yes, look at the details, but also have the fabric there for you to see the whole weaving. So those are some thoughts, and then I'm going to run through some of my photos. They're old now. They're from 4 and 5 years ago. Mostly a few are newer. And some questions that come to mind. And as I said, these are questions that we could research or that come up for me from my background in developmental research. But there are many other questions, too. This is just a starter. So how does the capacity to assess risk in young children, and I think of that longitudinally. When children first enter to kindergarten, how are they assessing risk? What does that look like after being a year there, and 2 years, and 3 years? Because we know from developmental research, we can define levels of development and see how children make progress. So a couple ideas here. Here's a child, and she feels that this situation is somewhat unstable, as we can see, and she's not going to stand up immediately. But she does stand up and goes down. Another child comes to the same place seconds later, actually. I was right there standing, and she didn't stop for a moment. She was completely confident in the stability there. Her assessment was done quite differently. And she seems to be working at a level where she's more confident with how she can manage this risk. Here's another example that I noticed. Here we have children lined up to jump from a ladder. And you see one child, and the interesting thing about this, and we talk about possibilities, and what's wonderful about the materials and equipment of Anji play is they offer possibilities in the way they're designed. In other words, there isn't one way to use the piece of equipment. The child can use the equipment as the child feels competent to use it. So we're trusting the competence of each child to use the equipment in the way that they can use it competently. And so this child comes to this rung, and she's going to step off and land on the cushion below. The next child came from the same rung, and he just jumped full force. He had a different level of assessment of the risk for himself. And then the next child jumped from the top. So you can see where the same piece of equipment, the same play material, offers children infinite possibilities. And how it allows them to start to think and make decisions for themselves and make assessments for themselves about what are my capacities, my experience of this equipment from the past, my sense of my own development, my sense of my own competencies here, what can I do? And no one is judging, wow, this child is the best because he's jumping from the top, or this other child is afraid because she has to step off. But rather, each child is respected for what he or she is capable of doing. What is the quality of problem solving when children engage in risky play? That's a question that comes to mind for me. You see often, and I'm sure all of you have seen this because you've all had a chance to visit the kindergartens, you see often that they will make judgments about risks and make adjustments. And that's exactly what this child was doing here in this example. Just checking it out. Then she's standing up, step back to look again. This is in a sequence. Another child's coming. And we all know this from our observations. You all have your own photos of this kind of thing. They help each other. So there's a co-regulation of the risk. That's a very important concept in research these days. So the one child is stabilizing for the other child. And then this child still is a little tentative. And then what happens? The child backs off, and what does this child do? She lowers herself to manage the risk because she could sense it was less stable. So what we're seeing is perceptual motor development. We're seeing awareness of what's going on around her, behind her, as well as in front of her, as well as under her feet. And we see this very delicate kind of problem solving, which is done cooperatively to create a situation of co-regulation. The child who was waiting, she felt very confident and just walked down the plank. When engaged in true play, how does the precision with which children design and construct things with open-ended play materials, again, this idea of possibilities, develop over time? Well, I can't show that longitudinally, although that's an interesting question. We can see it within extended play periods in the Anji kindergartens. And then there's a second part of that, because it's very rare, although you can see that in Anji kindergartens, children play alone. Usually they're playing with other children. So how does that interacting and collaborating together, so the development is not only within the individual, it's within the group. How does it increase the complexity of each child's learning in that situation? So we can find examples like this in any moment. We're in an Anji kindergarten and observing. They're very, very thoughtful about how they're building with these materials and how they fit together in their minds, and then they enact it out. So we see this kind of interaction and development in this way. I'm going to go through these slides quickly, but this was a fascinating time because these children had this symmetry of making the same kinds of things as a group again. And they started out, and you can see, at first when I walked over there and looked, I thought, well, it looks like they're making airplanes or something like that. That might be what they be, or they could be something else. We don't know. I can't speak Chinese, except for a couple words, so I couldn't really know what the children were talking about as they were building. I could only observe. And the play just developed. And it got more and more complex. There's an enthusiasm, an engagement, a joy. Times they were working together, times an individual would have an idea. It was fascinating. And that was about where they ended up. So again, it's quite an interesting process. And then I just showed this one quickly. They were off in the side. You may have seen them because this is just so amazing what was built. But again, anytime you visit an Anji kindergarten and look at children playing with blocks, you can find amazing examples. But they had created this amazing construction and decided that isn't what they ultimately wanted to create. So they took it apart and started again. There's no, it's not product oriented in their development, the way they work with this complexity. It's really their learning process which the children are engaged in. And I think when we do research, that's what we want to capture. And then I did this one because these were younger children. It was indoors with blocks. And this was a very interesting thing. I have a whole bunch of slides that I could show you to show this, but they were particularly interested. You can see that both girls have their hands on this one kind of block. And those blocks were in short supply. And you'll notice that this child, and he was working with a group of children where they were making this big structure that was flat, but they used those kind of blocks. So every time those children weren't paying attention, the girls would run over and get one more of those kind of blocks because they needed to work with them. So it was really fascinating. And then when they weren't paying attention, one of the boys would run over and take back the block. What evidence of the development of children's self-regulation can we actually observe in action as we observe the children engaged in true play in the Anji kindergartens? Pardon the quality of this video. I was using my phone, and I'm not the greatest videographer, but it does demonstrate a really important point. I'm not an expert at Macs. This is new, I'm sorry, PC. So this will take me a moment. So you are all here, and this is a structure in one of the kindergartens we visited. Children had put ladders along the side. They had cushions down below, and it was a jumping game. And in particular, pay attention to this child over here on the far right, because he wants to jump. But there's this group of children over to the left who are kind of managing the situation. And he's having to regulate his behavior. And you can see him hold his hands together. He's just waiting. He's able to inhibit the movement. Can he go now? Maybe. He still has to wait. But he has physical ways of managing his behavior. And then finally, he's looking, and he's very aware of what the other children are doing and saying. And so he waited until the girl on the left said, "You can jump now." So you have the self-regulation of the child, and you have co-regulation happening among the children at the same time. So you have the developing autonomous capacity to regulate self as the group is developing its capacity to regulate each other as a group working together. What evidence of social referencing? This is a very important construct in child developmental research for learning. Can we observe when children engage in true play? And of course, there's this whole idea, and this is an idea that I've been fascinated with forever, how do younger children learn from older children? In the Anji kindergartens, this is what I was told. I think it's true, but you can check with someone who knows better than I. People from the community can visit, and here a grandmother brought a toddler, her toddler grandchild, and he was visiting the kindergarten. You'll see the grandmother in the next slide. He saw these children playing with the ladder, And because the ladders are bamboo, even this young toddler could manage to carry one very competently. He found one that fit with him. And he brought it over to where the children were on the ladder, and you can see already the contact between the older child and him as he's carrying the ladder. The grandmother came by to see how it's going, and he's going to set up the ladder. She backed away. She's probably learned how it works in Anji. Let the children engage. And again, you see the social referencing happening. He gets to the top. Again, she's still interested in him and engaged, and they're making that contact. And she's staying with him as he gets down. He used the ladder to basically relate to different parts of the play area. So he took the ladder over here where other children were playing, and again, you see this kind of checking with the older child. There's a regulation happening there in the behavior. And what does the older child do? She's going to climb up. What does he do? He watches. His other friend came over, and she climbed up while he was climbing up. He waited till she got up, and then he got up. And he was very happy. I actually have a video of him clapping once he was up on top. Another kind of question that gets talked about a lot is and this is one of these 21st century skills, right? How does cooperation develop in children who have daily opportunities to engage in true play with each other? What's interesting is how quickly a group of children who weren't necessarily playing together, but this is during cleanup time or putting things away, they see something that requires a group effort to make it work. And they come together and manage that whole situation almost without any direction. They just seem to know what to do. But they are giving each other some help too. And there's a problem they're trying to solve here during cleanup time. And they solved it. And then finally, this whole area of mathematical knowledge and skills. And what's interesting is I heard a number of times in various comments over the last 2 days, children learning to count, number sense, some reference to number operations. But we know with mathematics that it's more than that, that patterning is very important for algebraic development. We also know from the work from Doug Clements in the United States at University of Denver that children's geometric knowledge is very important, and there's big development that happens during the kindergarten years in China, or what we would call the preschool years in the United States. Also in the area of science, there were references made to science learning, and we could start to some of those threads that we can see. There's an emphasis on what Darrell Greenfield in his research in the United States at Miami University talks about different processes that children are learning, and they're cross-cutting across different kinds of scientific content knowledge. So some of those processes children are learning are cause-effect. We heard those words said a lot, cause-effect. But there are others. There's prediction. What's going to happen if I set it up this way? There's part-whole relationships. Is a very important kind of learning that's cross-cutting around a lot of scientific and mathematical learning. Functional relationships. How does one thing relate to another and work together? There's the relationship between stability and change that children are learning about. And they're learning about transformation. So you put a seed in the ground, a sprout, you water it, a sprout comes up, it grows into a stem, and then there's a flower. So again, we can look at transformation processes across a whole lot of different areas, and we can see in the kindergartens in Anji, that those children, as they play, are actually developing their level of understanding, deepening their level of understanding over time of these kinds of scientific mathematical processes. Just a couple of examples. We've all seen this, and sometimes the children will draw a model and then make something. But, and that's the case with these two girls, but other times they will make something and then draw the model. And so what's very fascinating to me is they're working between 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions and using the two to support each other as they continue to develop their knowledge. And what it's also supporting in the area of executive functioning, which is an area that is getting a lot of attention for children's long-range development and 21st century skills, that what we're seeing here in the children's play is a kind of cognitive flexibility. They can work between these different dimensions and manipulate things in that way and use it for their learning. So you can see how he comes over, looks at it, checks. They're interested in what he's doing, and they continue. And then this is the last slide I have. Just again, I think it's so important. I think one of the things Mariana Bressoni said is outdoor play is very important, but what we know is children are playing indoors too, and I think it's important for us to always keep in mind, even though we have all these images from the outdoor play, that there's a lot going on indoors too. Sometimes it rains in Anji, and they are engaged with less big materials, with less open space, but they're, by the same token, they're engaged with playing with patterns, building, doing this kind of work. There are infinite possibilities for how Anji play can happen both indoors and outdoors. Thank you very much.